Good morning, scientists and explorers, and welcome to Virtual MOSI. My name is Charlie. I'm your presenter today, and I'm here to find out if you measure up. Well, we're going to talk about measuring today, and with that in mind, I have a question. When I'm measuring length, how do I determine the right tool and the right unit of measurement to use? So I want you thinking about that as we go through our program today. Scientists ask a lot of questions. We do a lot of measuring. Measuring is a part of what we do as scientists when we're observing things. It's a very precise way to observe things. But it's not just in science that we measure things. If you tuned into Virtual MOSI on time, it's because somebody was paying attention to what the clock was saying. That's measuring time. When I was driving today, I had to pay attention to how close my car was to the car ahead of me, how many car lengths I had ahead of me. That's measuring too. We measure all day, a lot of times without even thinking about it. Now, I have a question for you that's actually from last week. We're going to answer this question in just a couple of minutes, and the question is, what is the distance from King Henry's nose to the end of his thumb called? Now, think about that. If you happen to know the answer to that question, why don't you type in the answer in the chat box before I get to it in just a couple of minutes? Also, if you have any questions at all about measurement, type that into the chat box too, and we'll be glad to try and get to that at the end of our show. So let's talk about measuring. Now, when we measure things, we have different tools to use. There are lots of different things we measure, but primarily we measure four things, and I got some tools down here on the table I want to show you. We have things to measure length, for instance. Okay? Rulers you probably have at home. This one's in inches as well as in centimeters, metric system. I have a yardstick. You don't see these too many places anymore. A tape measure is very common in houses. You may have one in yours. Here's one that's pretty cool. This is actually from my dad's day. This is like a yardstick on steroids. And it just folds out and folds out and folds out. And it's not 1 yard long, but 6 feet long. That's 2 yards long. Now that's kind of handy because I can actually measure how tall I am with this. And also I can use it to social distance to keep people 6 feet away from me these days. Now you probably don't want to poke them with a stick like this. So anyway, those are things to measure length. Things to measure volume, how much of something you have. I've got a big measuring cup, a smaller measuring cup. These will measure things in fluid ounces and such like that. And then for smaller measurements, I've got my measuring spoons. Your kitchen probably has all this stuff here. Your kitchen may have things to weigh things with. For instance, I have a scale here that I use to weigh things for food. Now, if I want to weigh myself, I'm not going to step on this because I'll probably break it. Instead, I'll step on this, and that's for measuring people. Same tool, just different things you measure. You probably see these places you go. It's a temperature. That's a thermometer, actually. It's a digital one. Somebody's probably taken the temperature of your forehead at some point these days. Mine's 96, in case you were wondering. All right, so we have then distance, volume, weight or mass, and temperature. But what are the measuring systems we use? That's the first thing you always have to choose is, what measuring system am I going to use for what I'm measuring? We have the traditional system. Now that measures things in length in feet and inches and miles, volume in gallons and liquid ounces and such like that, pounds and tons to measure weight, degrees Fahrenheit to measure temperature. We also have the metric system. These are the two majors, traditional and metric. Metric system, we have meters for distance, liters for volume, grams for mass, and degrees Celsius for temperature. Then there are all sorts of informal measurements. You do this all the time without even thinking about it. You're trying to figure out, for instance, which pencil you want to use for the day. Maybe you compare the length of two pencils and see which one's longer. Use that one. You haven't measured how many inches or whatever the pencil is, but you still are measuring one thing against another. I mentioned car lengths. I have to make sure that I stay so many car lengths away from the car in front of me, depending on my speed. Today, when I stuck my head outside, I realized it was hot out there, and I wore a t-shirt. I didn't need to know what the exact temperature was. It was enough for me to know it's hot. And then we have some special purpose systems of measurement. Now, this is a little different. For instance, date and time are measured in their own way. There's no metric date or traditional way of measuring time. It's all in minutes and hours and days and months and years. By the way, if you want to get some good information on where the calendar and time measurements come from, you should check out a video I did about 2 months ago in June. It was all about the summer solstice and where our calendar comes from. So that'd be some interesting research for you. And I'm an astronomer, so I always am concerned about the distance of stars and such, and we measure that in light years. So those are just special purpose systems. But today we're going to focus mostly on traditional and metric. So the traditional system. Now, the traditional system of measurement is used here in the United States of America and nowhere else. Great Britain, United Kingdom, used to be on the traditional system, but they went metric in 1969, and practically the entire world is on metric. We're about the only ones. We measure length in units. The common units are inches, is our typical unit. That's an inch here on your ruler, of course. You know what those look like. You have feet, and that's the distance of a whole ruler. You have yards, which is the distance of my yardstick. And then you have things like miles that are really big. Volume, we measure things where they're tiny in teaspoons and tablespoons. A little more stuff, you're talking about fluid ounces and cups. When you're talking about big things that you might drink, you're talking about pints, quarts, and gallons and such like that. Weight, we're talking about ounces, pounds, and tons for showing weight. Fortunately, my weight isn't in tons, it is only in pounds. The thing about the traditional system, one of the problems with it is when it first got started, there was no real standardization to any of this stuff. All the weights we use in traditional systems come from traditional life way back when. Like, for instance, if you have a diamond ring, its weight's measured in carats. And that's C-A-R-A-T, not the stuff that you eat. But the carat that you weigh a diamond with is actually based on the weight of a carob seed. That's where the word actually does come from. So you'd weigh your diamond against so many seeds, and that was the weight of the diamond. In fact, that is answering actually the question I had for you, which was the distance between King Henry's nose and the end of his thumb. This was an attempt to make everybody agree on what a yard is. And that's the answer to the question. The distance from King Henry's nose to the end of his outstretched thumb, and looks like mine as well, is a yard. So there you go. The problem with the traditional systems, too, is that if I'm converting one unit of measure to another, it usually involves some funky math. Okay? Like, for instance, there's 128 fluid ounces to a gallon. So if I want to know how many ounces are in a gallon and a half, I got some serious number crunching to do. Usually I'm having to multiply or divide by some funky numbers. 16 ounces to a pound, 36 inches to a yard, 5,280 feet to a mile. You get the idea. You have some really weird things you're having to convert. But the traditional system is what we're used to, and there's a lot to using something that you're used to using, even if it's not always the easiest. The metric system is what practically the entire rest of the world uses, and all scientists everywhere use the metric system. Yes, even here in America. Now, metric system, as I already mentioned, has certain base units that we use. Length and distances in meters, volumes in liters. Weight, which we call mass in the metric system, is in grams. Now, weight is actually a different thing from mass. Your teacher in school will tell you all about this. Weight is how much pressure something is exerting because of gravity's pull on it. Okay? For instance, I weigh about 200 pounds. But if I went to the moon, where they have 1/6 the gravity that they have right here on planet Earth, I would weigh only about 40 pounds on the moon. Okay? Well, that's because, of course, there's less gravity pulling me down. But my mass, I'm about 200 pounds here on Earth in weight. I'm about 100 kilograms in mass. My mass is the same here on Earth, on the moon, on Jupiter, wherever. Because when I'm comparing mass, it's on a balance beam. And the weight on one side has to equal what the weight is on the other. So the nice thing about the metric system from a scientist standpoint is it's good anywhere. The measurements you make throughout the universe are going to be on the same type of thing. They use common prefixes to show larger and smaller units in the metric system. For instance, what we have is a meter. You break it down into centimeters, which is 1/100th of a meter, or millimeters, which is 1,000th of a meter. Or you can expand it to kilometers, which is 1,000 meters. But in any case, if you're going to convert from one thing to another, it's just a matter of moving the decimal point, either multiplying or dividing by 10. So for instance, if I have 1.5 meters long, well, I know that's 150 centimeters long. That's 1,500 millimeters long. The math becomes super easy. But that's a metric system, and we here in America, well, we just don't use it as much as we should, but that's the way it goes. Now we're going to talk about measuring length, and this is where we're going to try and answer the question that I kind of posed, and that is, how do I decide what I'm going to use to measure something, either as far as what the tool is I want to use or what the unit of measurement is going to do. So there's some things to think about. First, choose the best system of measurement. Now, one of the things we think about here is, how important is it to have precision? Okay? When I stuck my head out the door this morning, I didn't need to know the temperature of the air, but it was enough for me to know it was hot. So I dressed appropriately for hot weather. I have actually a coffee table at home that had glass on the inside of it. It's in a wooden frame. I broke the glass. So I had to order more glass. For that, my measurement had to be super precise, down to 1/8 of an inch, because I want the glass to actually fit precisely on the table. So always consider how precision you need to the job done. You need to also consider who you're going to use the measurement for. If I'm going to take a measurement into the hardware store because I need a certain screw of a certain length, that measurement has to be real precise. I also need to figure out if I'm going to be doing this for science. Now, usually in science, we'd measure everything metric. Today, I've actually got an activity for you, and we're going to talk about using traditional measures. But if you've got the stuff to measure it in metric at home, so much the better. So choose the best system of measurement. Choose the best tool for the job, considering the shape and size of the object. Now, for instance, if I want to measure the length of this table, I could use a ruler to do that. And that would be awesome, but the problem is, every time I move the ruler to measure a little bit further, I have an opportunity to make a mistake. In other words, I could stack all these rulers one on top of the other, but if I don't do it precisely, my measurement's going to be wrong. So it's nice to have a tool that is somewhat like the length of what you want to measure. Rather than using a ruler to measure the table, it might be better to use the yardstick. Better still, to use my daddy's 6-foot folding measure. But if I really want to measure the whole thing at one shot, well, that's where a tape measure really comes in handy, because tape measures can be very long. So it's always nice to use a tool that is fitted to the job. I could measure Raymond James Stadium with one of these guys, but it would take an awful long time to do it. Far better to use like a wheel that you can roll on the ground. So choosing the right tool for the job, choose a tool that is sized for what it is you want to measure. Choose the best measuring unit for the job. Again, if I'm measuring Raymond James Stadium, I probably don't need to know how many inches it is. Instead, it's probably fine if I can say how many yards or feet Raymond James Stadium is, or even larger units of measurement for that. Now, this is something that is sometimes a problem. It's just something you need to pay attention to. But once you've checked this, you don't have to check it again. Always check the 0 position on your ruler. Make sure you know what I'm talking about here. Now, let's get zoomed in here real close. You see on this yardstick here, I've got 1 inch right here, okay, and then I've got the same number of markings over here that I have going to 2 inches here. This is the 0 unit on my ruler right here at the edge of the ruler. There are occasionally rulers that you will find that have a little gap between the end of the ruler and where the 0 mark is. Make sure you always use the 0 mark. Most rulers won't be a problem, but once you've checked that, you're good to go. And for critical measurements, folks, again, like the glass on my coffee table, I'm measuring that twice. In construction, they always say measure twice, cut once. Well, it's always a good idea to measure twice because sometimes your eye tricks you. So it's always good for critical things to make really sure of your measurements. So we've talked about some different ideas about how we go about selecting the right things to measure. Let's talk about some activities. Now, an easy activity you can do at home is go on the internet, and if you Google measurement scavenger hunt, you will find dozens of things like this on the internet. Now, this is just sort of almost a tic-tac-toe thing, but basically there are different measurements and things to look for, and you write in the name of whatever it is you find that matches that in your home. For instance, find a book that is 6 inches tall. Find something white that is 12 inches long. Find an object that is 5 centimeters long. Basically, you just fill these things out, and it's a whole scavenger hunt to go through your house. Like I said, tons of these things. You can do it competitively with your friends or siblings if you'd like to do that too. Another fun activity that I had kind of answers the question that I had at the very beginning of the show. How do you measure up? And you can measure you. One thing that was my parents always did when I was growing up, and I mean from when I was a tiny little fellow, they always kept track of the height that my sister and I were on the door frames of our bedrooms. Now, don't do any of this sort of thing about marking things on the wall without your parents' permission, okay? You got to have that. But basically what happened was, every couple of years, my parents would line us up next to the door frame. They'd put a book or something like that on top of our heads. A ruler will do as well. You want to make sure the book or ruler is level and you're standing flat-footed, okay? No tippy toes or anything like that. And then a friend can mark the wall right where that ruler comes in on the wall or on the door frame. Once you have that height, you can then measure how tall you are. So what do you think? Should I use a ruler to measure how tall this mark is from the floor? No, remember what I told you about having to move it and reposition it? Now, if a ruler's all you got, a ruler's what you use. But if you have something longer, like 6 feet long, for instance, you only have to move it. You don't have to move it at all, actually. And that just takes away a lot of air. So measure how tall you are. Measure how long your hand is, how long your fingers are. Now, would you measure your fingers in feet? No. You'd probably use inches. Now, if you need to get smaller than an inch, if you need to be more precise, then what we do is we use fractions of inches here in the traditional system. Like, for instance, my finger is a little more than 4 inches long. Okay? Now, if I look, I've got 4 big divisions to each inch. I've got 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, and the next full inch. So basically, my finger is 4 inches and 1/4 inch long. If I'm having to measure something for a glove, for instance, I want to have a very precise measurement. So just measure all kinds of things on your body, your feet. How long are your feet? How long is your leg? Here's one that your parents are probably going to not like so much. How big around are you? Well, I don't like it because I'm bigger around than I should be. Now that comes up with a measuring problem. Check this out. I can't really wrap this around me, can I? most rulers and measuring sticks aren't so good at that. Even measuring tape that you have, like for working with construction, isn't really made to bend quite that way. So if you need to measure something around, whether it's around your body or the distance around a ball or whatever, you're going to use a little helper. Now check this out. I just got some string here. You could use tape. You could use a piece of ribbon, a sash to some clothing that you don't need, a belt for that matter. What you want to do is you want to take the thing and wrap it around you nice and tight. And look where the thing crosses over on itself. I got the end of it right here in my fingers. Look where the string crosses over on itself, and I put my thumb right there. Now with my thumb locked there, this length of string is how far around I am. And now all I have to do is put it against my measuring stick, and I find out that I'm really fat. I don't want to say what that measurement is because it's embarrassing. Anyway, but you get an idea. The whole thing is to measure yourself and see how you measure up, and keep track of your measurements. As you grow, your measurements are going to get bigger and change, and it's a great way to kind of keep track of your progress. Now, we're getting towards the end of our time together, and I have a question that I want you guys thinking about until tomorrow. Okay? We're going to answer this in tomorrow's Virtual MOSI. So check out this question. Approximately how many viruses and bacteria are in one drop of seawater? Wow. I would guess it'd be more than a couple. I don't really know the answer to that. And if you don't know either, tune in tomorrow morning for Virtual MOSI, and we'll try and get you some answers to that. Well, folks, I can see by the clock our time is almost up, measuring time. And so it's time for us to say so long. Thank you for tuning in to Virtual MOSI. Always keep discovering wherever you are, and have a great day.